Hello, what's up? Welcome to The Cheapest Medicine. As always, your host, Roberto, and guys, it is nice to be back. Sorry I was away for so long. I just had my life take a 360 turn. I just moved away from Europe, from Spain, and came back to my country, which I have not lived in Costa Rica for 22 years. I know, it's kind of crazy. I moved away, as a situation in the world, it's been a really fucked up year, and everything I was doing in Spain kind of went through shit. So I just took the decision and said, fuck it, let's move back home, get myself settled, get myself back on my feet, and whatever the fuck is going out there is not going to stop me. So that's the one thing that I'm doing, getting myself over here and achieve goals that I've always had in my mind, which is bring my experience to my country and from there on build something in the world of football and also in my private business. And one of those things is my podcast. So it is nice to be back. And today I have a really cool guest. He is a friend that I met over in Seville when we went over to visit, and he used to work for Atlanta United. So he was one of the strength and conditioning and sports scientists from the team. And today, obviously, the topic is going to be around the world of football, strength and conditioning, the academy, but also his experience from the MLS and a little bit of mine also over in Spain working for Real Betis. So with that being said, guys, it is nice to be back. Welcome to The Cheapest Medicine. Let's keep moving forward and let's make what's best of what's going on with our lives, regardless of whatever is out there. We always got to move forward. Let's give life to this new episode, and let's give myself a welcome back to this podcast. Yo, what's up, Norbert? Welcome to my podcast, dude. It is awesome to have you here.
Thank you, Roberto. It's a pleasure to be on, mate.
Thank you, man. It's been quite a while since we met each other. I remember over there in Seville, you did that trip, and you stayed at my place. Showed you a little bit of where I was at the moment. So, how's everything going in the United States at the moment?
Things are going considering the situation with the pandemic. It's getting worse by the minute, but we're doing our best to, I guess, survive and during these interesting times, to say the least.
Yeah, it's a complicated year. It's a year that is changing a lot of things. A year that hopefully things get a little bit more normalized and we can all get back to work. And I know there's a lot of controversy, what is going on, what is not, but that is not today's topic. Obviously, we're going to focus on football. We're going to focus on the young athletes, strength and conditioning. So the listeners can get a little bit to know about you. To know a little bit about you is, what have you been doing the last couple of years at Atlanta United? Who is Norbert? What's your experience in this world?
That's a very good question. Sometimes I don't even know the answer. But last 2.5 years, so my role at the Atlanta United recently ended. So I was the quote unquote academy fitness coach for all the academy teams within the Atlanta United football structure, which was all the way from under 12s all the way up to under 19s, which is about 7 teams or 7 age groups, I should say. So I've spent the last 2.5 years working with those guys there, and it's a fantastic experience just being able to see the league firsthand and then kind of contribute to the development stages of all the players that we had at the club. So that's where I was for the last 2.5 years, and prior to that, I spent working various different roles within the collegiate and the sort of the high school system in the United States, and throughout that process, I obviously work with tons of different sports. I mean, soccer was the sort of the primary sport that I was interested in and continue to be interested in, but I did get a lot of exposure to different team sports and individual sports and things like that. So that's what I did the first 5 years prior to me going into Atlanta United. And obviously during that time, I did get a chance to do my master's degree overseas in Australia. So I did get the opportunity to go there for some time and spend some time learning from some world-class practitioners down in Australia. And that was a lifetime experience on its own.
So you have a great resume. You have a great experience. You've been all over the place, kind of like myself. Like you said, United States, been around the college, the high school level, and not just, needless to say, Australia, go all the way over there. As we know, Australia is one of the top countries when we talk about strength and conditioning. It's one of the countries that leads, one of the big schools, or some of the best professionals come from there. Now, talking about strength and conditioning, development stages in football. This is an area that I've been myself also in, obviously more on the rehab side, but it's an area that still I think it needs a lot of improvements. I think is the right terminology that would come out of here, that things need to improve in football, especially in the young development stages. And working at Atlanta United, what can you say that probably is the good and the bad? What can you say what's good in strength and conditioning in football? What do you think needs more improvements?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think when you look at football and when you look at sort of the physical aspect of the game, I think United States, when you want to compare it to the top sort of 5 European leagues, they're miles behind, if you ask me. Obviously, places like England have been doing it for decades and decades, and so their sort of platform of development is completely different than what the teams in US can offer and can do. And obviously there's a massive sort of budgetary and resource limitation that ties into that, which is probably the reason that we're still trying to play catch up to the highest level of the game overseas. And I would say it's not necessarily a downside, but it's definitely a limiting factor when it comes to wanting to aim high but not being able to sort of make the progression as fast as you would want to make. So, and then obviously the good side is that you, more often than not, a lot of these clubs that you get a chance to work for, is there's a clean slate, so to speak. So you can go in, and if you have the sort of necessary experience and for lack of a better term, the knowledge level, you can kind of go in and build things up from the ground up, which is a massive advantage, and you can kind of shape it in a way that you want to shape it and kind of direct the program the way you want to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. So you mentioned two big things over here. Talking about obviously the MLS, and we compare it to countries like England, countries like Spain, countries like Germany, some of the, obviously the top leagues in the world. And we compare academies, things are very different. Obviously the football level in the European leagues are better. I mean, that's going to be real. Yeah. I think the European football is always going to be, right now, and has been for many years, the top leaders of the game. When it comes down to strength and conditioning, it does change between countries. I mean, Spain has good stuff. I'm not going to say everything inside Spain is bad, but I'm going to be real. After knowing a little bit of what's going on in England, for example, you went there as well as myself. We went to Liverpool. You kind of saw a little bit of what goes on in the strength and conditioning in such a big club like this one. And it was something that I, in my opinion, can say that is way more advanced than what was going on in Real Betis. It was, I think, in my opinion, it was more organized. It was better that what was going on. The team was going on. At Real Betis, I'm going to be real, I did not like what was going on in the strength and conditioning world. I think there's a lot of improvements that needed to be done on the academy level, and especially when it needs to be focused on what's the demand of the player. And that's what was something that I really liked about Liverpool. It was always focused on, I want to make my soccer player more resilient, be able to resist more of the stresses that we're going to impose on them. And then at the same time, be able to make them better on the pitch. Where in Real Betis, it wasn't that, but I just thought that it had no order. It had nothing to really follow. It kind of like you had to build something. And as you mentioned here, it goes into the other one, building something from a blank page. It's like a clean slate, as you said. That is something really cool to do. I know the US is still growing a lot. The good thing about the United States is there's a lot of economical power. There's a lot of money that comes into the MLS, especially the teams that are growing. And it's a league that's building more teams in. They're building a really big structure. And there's obviously the United States has a lot of money in that is going to help improve, I think, the game in the country itself. But I think there's still a big difference between the level of the game of the other one. Now, if we focus on strength and conditioning itself, what's one of the things you can say in the MLS that teams are looking for a young player to have to be able to reach the pro level?
Look, I think at the end of the day, regardless of the country you're in, the biggest sort of deciding factor whether a player goes up and does become a professional player or doesn't is their sort of technical, tactical ability, if for lack of a better term, and then sort of how they stand apart from rest of the pack within an academy setup. And a lot of times these player profiles, so to speak, are not necessarily a physical one. So there's loads of players that go through the ranks and they're physically non-dominant, so to say, and then they do end up becoming professional players because of their superior ability on the ball and off the ball, for that matter. That sets them apart from everybody else. And I think a lot of times, like we in this profession, I think we get carried away with our sort of influence in terms of like, oh, if a certain player did like S&C throughout their development stage, then that could have been the differentiating factor whether they become a professional or not. It is true in some sense, but a lot of times the player, it comes down to talent, and if they don't have the talent, then you could be the most physically gifted and trained player, but if you don't have a sort of the game knowledge and the ability to execute that, then how good of a professional player can he possibly be and last in the game very long? And I've seen players come and go that they become pros and then they last about a year, and then that's kind of the end of the route for them, and they end up trying to go to a different club every year, but there's always a missing piece of the puzzle, if you know what I'm trying to say.
You touched a very touchy subject over here when it comes down to sports, because it's going to hit. And I think you hit a very important one. You're right. You can have somebody who's physically gifted or, has done a great physically conditioned programs throughout his development stages in reaching the pro level. But if you don't have the talent, I'm sorry, but you're not going to make it. And that's the reality when it comes down to sports. There is that factor. It's a massive factor. If you don't know how to play the game, you don't know how to be well positioned, you don't have that soccer IQ that people are looking for, then it's going to be hard for you to be able to reach that. And that is something that you got to train on the tactical part. And I like that you mentioned that strength and conditioning can do so much, because it's true. I mean, I think, yes, at the end of the day, strength and conditioning is what's going to keep you healthy. And it's something that I think it comes a little bit more into sports, not just football. I've seen it in the NBA. I've seen it in the NFL. I've seen it in other Olympic sports when it comes down. And this is the one thing I want to mention. It's injury prevention. This is probably the biggest part where now strength and conditioning is really coming into play, where let's talk about it. Even the young athletes, we're having long seasons. They're having plenty of games around the season. And a lot of times it comes down to how healthy are my players? Are they able to keep themselves together throughout the amount of stress or the amount of trips, the amount of games they're having without getting injured? And especially if we think about the pro level. But this is the one thing that strength and conditioning needs to change in the world of sports is I need to keep my athletes healthy. And that's the number one thing that I can say from one of the teams here in Costa Rica that I just saw this past week. And it was one of the things I was talking to one of the directors of the club is the main focus of strength and conditioning, obviously, as well as, trying to improve some physical factors of the game, like, having the ability to jump a little higher, be a little bit quicker, have a better response and, different gestures from the game, is to be able to be more resilient, to be able to adapt to the different type of stresses and the amount of fatigue they're going to be having throughout the season. So it would be nice to hear from you. I know you've been working through the MLS. It's one of those leagues, again, that it's growing a lot. And knowing the United States that they're super into the strength and conditioning world and in a different aspect compared to what I've seen in Europe, it would be nice to see or hear what you have to say about that.
No, yeah, I think the world of S&C, strength and conditioning, is very popular, obviously, in US because of the heavy influence of other team sports such as American football and basketball and things like that. But I think with soccer specifically, granted, how much foreign influence has there been over the last as long as I know, in terms of coaches coming over here from South America and being in or even from European teams coming over to coach a lot of these MLS clubs have sort of brought over that different influence that they are used to, and the way they do things over there has been sort of influencing the level of player care that needs to be provided to these players. So, for instance, for my first sort of 6 months at my role in Atlanta United at the time, I was fortunate enough to be part of sort of the entire structure of the club. So I was able to be around the first team, be around the reserves team, help with the academy. So you get to see how different people operate, and you touch on the Spanish sort of way of doing things. And at the time, Tata Martino was the head coach of Atlanta United. So being able to be around that and see how they train and the level of intensity and the level of sort of practices that they expect the players to be able to do, it was actually eye-opening because they were pushing limits. Yes, there was, of course, there's always injuries associated with training, but they were trying to essentially break the boundaries, if you will. And to see that, you kind of makes you think differently in how you approach your development as well. Because at the end of the day, if an academy player is meant to become a professional and they're not developed in a way that they can go and sort of withstand those kind of stresses that are being thrown at them at the highest level of the game, then I guess we as professionals have sort of failed to do our job in a sense. And I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that's it's kind of where I saw it.
Yeah, I get you. I mean, it's at the end of the day, it's very similar in every league, and to that point where it's able to adapt somebody to the different type of stresses of the calendar that they're going to be having throughout the season. And strength and conditioning, like I mentioned before, is going to be that big factor to be able to help your athletes reach that. Yeah. And this is where it becomes tricky. How do you do this? What do we do to be able to not overtrain our athletes? Are the exercises that we're programming going according to the demand of our football player? Is it really focused to locomotion? And this is something that I've been reading a lot throughout, not just social media, but also through people that have been posting, studies or posting information out there and sharing what their knowledge is. At the end of the day, strength and conditioning needs to go according to the sport. And at the end of the day, what most people do is they run, they change direction, they do sharp stops, they jump, they land, they're able to accelerate, they're able to be able to resist, being able to run at high speeds, to be able to do it constantly, to be able to do repetitively. And this is the one thing that it becomes tricky a lot of times. How do you do this when we have, I don't know, we talk about the professional level, we're talking sometimes 7-9 months time, and there's some, and obviously we're talking about the European League. Sometimes they have games every 3 days or every week there's a game. We talk about the academy level, or it depends if the team didn't reach any cup level tournaments. And this is the one thing that still becomes a debate in football. This is how do you do this? How do we evaluate? How do we train this stuff? What do we build? And I would like to hear it from you as someone who's been working alongside, like you said, you work with the pros, you work with the academy, you've been working around all the areas in Atlanta United, and it would be nice to hear that from you.
No, yeah, obviously those are the $1 million questions that we try to answer a lot of times. And I think when it comes to, I mean, I can speak specifically about youth development in United States, is that the competitive sort of nature of the game is very high, and it's very, very demanding on the players, and they do end up playing quite a lot of games throughout the year, and the time that they spend away from the game is very, very little. So with that being said, obviously there's different limitations in regards to how much access you have to the player in terms of like a SNC/sports science sort of support that you can give to the players. So there's your programming and your sort of influence can only be as good as the amount of time you're given to work with these players. And I know a lot of people are saying, oh, you can do X, Y, and Z in this time and it will be better or whatever. But at the end of the day, if your time with the players is limited, then your service is also limited. So when you compare to a top European team, they have access to academy players more or less most of the time, most of the day. So they can provide service at a much greater level to these players when it comes to development. But to go back to your question, I think first and foremost, like you have to consider obviously the stages of development. So one of, I guess, the first tasks that I had to sort of build a program from scratch for the guys at Atlanta was that, okay, we have players going from under 12s all the way up to under 19s. And if they go through all of these age groups within our structure, what does that look like long term? So then we're talking about a long-term athletic development plan. And I know there's quite a lot on this topic within the scientific literature, and there's agreement and there's disagreement on the topic, but at the end of the day, you need some sort of development pathway that you can identify and you can say, okay, this is the approach we're taking to help these players optimize their development. And everybody's going to develop differently at the end of the day, but our job is to kind of help them reach their genetic potential, for lack of better word. So with that being said, then for me, I mean, I look at this from all different angles, and the younger they are, the more focus there is on the fundamentals of movement. Like you talked about locomotion, we talk about movement in the weight room and things of that nature. And then the older they get, so sort of that past peak high velocity age, with around 15, 16-year-old, then the emphasis sort of switches on, okay, how can we optimize your practices to get the most out of you physically? So then you're looking at an integrated sort of planning and periodization of practices and your sort of soccer specific games and exercises to help these players develop further physically and also technically and tactically and psychologically, to prepare to kind of bridge that gap between them and the pros.
Yeah, totally. You mentioned great points. Number one, time. This is the number one limitation that we have as strength and conditioning or rehab coaches is time. A lot of times we wish we could have 2 hours to be able to have them, because in 2 hours we can do a lot. Sometimes we just have 30 minutes, 20 minutes. Sometimes we just have 40 minutes, and we need to come up with something for a group of players, because it would be cool if it was just one client. We're talking about sometimes we're having 18, 20 players at once, and we're trying to build something efficiently in 30 minutes, and it becomes really complicated. And it also depends a lot on the facilities of the team. I can say, obviously, I don't know, probably Atlanta United has an amazing training center. I can say that Real Betis, where I was, did not have a good training center. And sometimes, I mean, we were able to bring more equipment in, but the gym itself, I'm gonna just be real, it's fucking shit. And it wasn't good, man. And it's sometimes inside this small little area, we had to come up with something, and it becomes a little bit complicated. Now, you also mentioned two big points over here, which was the young ages. When you're young teenagers coming up all the way to become young adults, you build that fundamentals. And this is massive. This is huge. This is something that I want a lot of people to understand is when you ask someone, what should my 12-year-old be doing? Focus on the fundamentals, because it doesn't mean just because you're 12, you're not going to be doing them up when you're a pro. You're going to be building upon the fundamentals. You never stop building upon them. But at these young ages, this is the time to focus on them as much as you can. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to be able to reach 20 years old and you're having issues over here. Unless you have an injury or something happen, obviously that changes the plan and changes things a little bit. But if you're someone who's 12 and you haven't been doing that stuff, you haven't been in training, when you reach the pro levels, it becomes a little bit of an issue in the strength and conditioning area. And then you talked about when you reach the pro level, how you bump up the intensity, you bump up the focus or whatever you're trying to really emphasize. At the end of the day, it comes down to be more specific to the game. You start trying to focus more on how much power I can get out of this player doing this type of gesture. Can they be quicker? Can they jump higher? Can they bump onto somebody a little bit better? Can we build some muscle mass on this guy? Because at the end of the day, at the pro level, we know the level of intensity is way, way higher than it, especially you're at the academy. This is where the big bucks are made and where people want to see entertainment. We're at the end of the day, we're the entertainment business, and you want to see good players perform well, do a good game. At the end of the day, that's what people are paying for. They want to see a high level game, and you want to have the actors or the people responsible to keep that game interesting to be well fit and to be able to perform it at a high level. Now, strength and conditioning is something that in football struggles to get in. It's still, sports science is one of those things that still has trouble to getting in football. There's still a lot of times where you see things that, in my opinion, do not go according to the game, or I don't know where people pull it out of their ass and they start building upon programming, and it ends up looking like a circus. I don't know if you've had that issue at Atlanta United where you start seeing exercises where you begin to question, what is really going on? Is this really helping my athlete? Why isn't people really focusing on trying to sometimes simplify things a little more, use some literature, use some science, use some common sense at the end of the day, and make the program go according to, like what you said, sports specific. At the end of the day, what are we doing? These are soccer players. So like I said, again, the question would be have you had that issue where you feel that sports science is still struggling to get into football?
Look, I think, at the end of the day, the struggle is always going to be there. And one of the things I learned, I think we have to realize that the game and the training sessions in and of itself take the utmost priority, and we're just there to act as a secondary sort of support system for the players and for the rest of the staff. So our job is to kind of look and to fill in the gaps and sort of connect the bridges, if you will, within whatever the missing piece of the puzzle is for the day, for the week, for the month, or what have you, right? So I think I was lucky enough to work with a set of fantastic staff members within the academy, and then we had coaches from all walks of life and from different backgrounds. So that was in and of itself a great sort of challenge to be able to sort of accommodate to different styles and different sort of mentalities and mindsets when it comes to the game. So I mean, the issues you're mentioning, like I was lucky enough not to necessarily have those issues, and then I think I had to be very creative in terms of how I gain influence and how I gain the ability to kind of do the things that I want to do from my end of things, and so to, I guess, to go back to your question, like we sort of have this like system of, or we had, because I'm no longer there, we had this system of priorities of, okay, what is going to make the biggest difference for the players, for the coaches, and then at the end of the day for myself in terms of what I want to do. So when I look at it that way, it's always, okay, practice first, games first. Okay, so then it becomes a matter of, okay, what is your periodization like? What is your training structure like? So then can we maximize that to get what I want physically out of the guys, and then what coaches want as well in terms of technical, tactical, psychological aspects. So then from then on, okay, then what are the gaps that we need to fill in? Okay, and then you kind of look to individualize as best as you can from a strength and conditioning standpoint. Like, there's a group of guys that need more strength work. There's a group of guys that need more power work. There's a group of guys that need to put on weight. So then you kind of filter that in, and then now you all of a sudden are put in a platform where you can service to these players on an individual basis, and the head coach continues to stay happy with what you're doing, as opposed to other way around, trying to go in and tell them, hey, this is how it's going to be. We're going to lift weights. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And then they just look at you. They're like, yeah, we're not doing that. So then all of a sudden you find yourself in a situation where you can't provide the service you thought you wanted to provide. And then now you end up playing catch up, if that makes sense.
You do mention some stuff that I didn't have the chance to really do where I was at. It was still like, you'll be surprised sometimes in Europe. A lot of people think, oh, because this is the highest level, you're going to find some teams that are more organized. And the reality was, it wasn't like that. At Real Betis, there was a lot of things we need to build. A lot of things needed to change in the strength and conditioning world. And I had trouble with it. As a rehab coach, I would see constant injuries, or these constant repetitive level of injuries. When I went down to see what was going on in strength and conditioning, the whole thing was shit. There was no plan. There was no head and or something to follow. It was like a headless chicken just doing weight room stuff, that because this is good for this muscle, this is good for that, or I read this, and it really didn't have an order or something that they were periodizing, as you said. You need that periodization to be able to, get something organized, to be able to have, okay, this is what we're doing. This is what we're going to try to do to make our team better. Because at the end of the day, strength and conditioning is just something that's going to help the game. Because at the end of the day, obviously, we know football is the number one priority. Strength and conditioning is over here. I say sometimes is next to it, but it's just something that's going to be some extra factor to be able to keep the game going. At the end of the day, football is the number one priority. So it's nice to see that you had that opportunity. I didn't really have it. I had to do a lot of changes as one of the rehab coaches. It was something that I always had to fight. I always had to go talk and be like, yo, we need to change things in the strength conditioning, because I'm tired of seeing. There was a moment where I had 15 rectus femoris tears at once. And it all came down when I used to see what was going on in strength conditioning. And then obviously you put in the level of intensity the coaches are trying to build in football. You say strength conditioning isn't helping at all. And then when we started switching things, the injuries began to reduce and things began to change, because at the end of the day, it is easier to prevent or to reduce the risk than to start curing and treating people, trying to see if they can get out from pain. So it's nice to hear that. This is something I also saw at the time that that really short time I was able to see Liverpool, and I was able to, shadow what was going on there, do a little bit of, work. They let me work on something and, see how things were being done over there. And they had that aspect as periodization. Now going into building a season, building a microcycle or something like that. How do you build that in the academy level? How do you build something or periodize strength and conditioning in a game where sometimes the microcycle ends up every weekend? It's 1 week thing. It's a 1 week thing. So
Yeah.
how do you do it?
Yeah. Sorry, before I answer that question, I'd like to go back to what you just mentioned in regards to the sort of having the opportunity to do certain things versus not doing it. I mean, for me, it was a product of endless hours in terms of trying to make a real difference to the program. So it was, I think, 2.5 years after looking back, I think it took a lot of time and a lot of conversations and discussions to paint a picture of what it is that we want to achieve. And I think you talked about having a lot of injuries, and I think that that's true at almost a lot of places, and then people will probably not admit to this, but that's the reality of the sport. If you push boundaries, you push limits, you will have injuries. But if your practices aren't right and your sort of the way you go about things aren't necessarily like have a method to it, then you might run into a lot of issues. But I think that was one of the things that we were able to make sort of simple fixes, and there's no rocket science to a lot of things, but it was like simple ideas, simple changes, simple sort of methods of progression, variation, overload, you name it, right? Whether it was in the gym, whether it was on the pitch, whether it was strategies like player rotation, measuring growth and maturation to sort of make recommendations to the coaches to rest certain players versus modify minutes and what have you. So it was all these kind of elements like coming together to sort of move towards the direction of, okay, now we have less injuries, which means we have more players available, which means you can train harder, train differently if you choose to, and then push boundaries and kind of see what comes out of it, if that makes sense.
Did you answer my question?
That was the first one, and then fast forward to what you asked in regards to the planning, the microcycle and macrocycle and all of that. So I think that's obviously very much dependent on the competitive game schedule and sort of where my sort of idea that I adapted from sort of Arsenal's way of development and Des Ryan's work that's been very well documented in the literature was that sort of 15, 16 years old or age group is where you kind of become all about planning and periodization of your practices, your gym sessions, and what have you. Because at that age, you're sort of almost tipping over after growth, and you're kind of where things get very, very competitive, and your primary aims become, yes, development, but also being able to win games. So then backtracking from that, then we look at, obviously there's a preseason phase where it will vary year by year, and then it could be 4 weeks, it could be 6 weeks, and then sort of we build the guys up from there, depending on how much time we have, and then from there onwards, it's sort of almost week to week approach at times where you look to work out the structure of the week in relation to the game that you have coming up, or games, because a lot of times you do play more than one game. So the sort of the pieces of the puzzle in terms of the work you do in the gym and the work you do on the field kind of has to be modified and sort of planned in according to what becomes the priority at the end of the day. So, there might be weeks where you go and have 2 gym sessions, and there might be weeks where you have 1, there might be weeks where you have none, and you have to sort of find an alternative of, okay, can I do this instead of that, and make it work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally makes sense. I mean, going back to the first thing, as the first part of your answer, yeah, you had that nicely. You were able to have that at Atlanta United. At Real Betis, it wasn't like that. Things had to build from scratch, literally. Things had to be completely changed, and that wasn't something that was easy. I left when things were beginning to get a little better, and it's still I think it needs a lot of improvement, and things a lot of more structure behind the strength and conditioning realm, especially at the academy level. And I'm talking about like you said, the 16 and above ages. I'm not talking lower. I think lower, you can make things a little more simple. Again, just focus on the fundamentals and don't get so anal about, periodizing at those ages. But when you get older, I think you do need that, especially when I start seeing the level of intensity of the training sessions, the games that they have, the tournaments that they're playing, the amount of trips that they have to do, that also have to comes into consideration. And at that level, I think strength and conditioning still needs an improvement over at that club, and I hope they do it. I think it's a club that has the potential to do it, and they should be more responsible about that. Now, uh, as you mentioned, it's you have to adapt to what's going on in the calendar, and soccer does have that. I mean, you start looking at the amount of games they have, the amount of trips. So many things come into play when it comes down into periodizing in soccer. I mean, it's kind of different when I'm seeing Olympic sports where it even becomes more structured, because Olympic sports sometimes really focuses on the one competition to be able to qualify the Olympics or Pan Americans or any of these big type of competitions. Soccer is different, or team sports are different when it gets down into that.
Mhm.
You every single game is important. Every single game, either you win, you're moving forward, you lose, you're just bouncing back, and you're going to have a hard time, and it's going to really affect the team. In Olympic
Mhm.
sports, sometimes these competitions are more of a practice session, and you're probably sometimes you even go really fatigued into these games. Where in soccer or in team sports, you're trying to reach these games always at a very high level to be able to do well. When that's the big difference that I wanted to mention here, because this is one of the questions a lot of people have asked me on, or some people ask me on social media, is what changes from the Olympic sports to the team sports level. It's totally different goals, totally different mindsets, totally different focuses that they have. Again, teams, you have every single game will count. Well, Olympic sports, sometimes these competitions ain't more, but like, hey, we're adding this, to get you in the competition environment, to get you figured out, but we're not really focusing right now on making that Olympic mark. That would be later on when we do the tapering. And that's what one thing that's really changes from the team sports in here. Now, as we're finishing up over here, man, and not to make the podcast extremely long, and obviously this is a topic that can really go into extent. There's a lot of debates in strength and conditioning and team sports and sports like soccer. What are the new things coming in? What are the new information? What's the new literature saying about soccer or team sports or anything that's really coming into the world of soccer that's probably changing the game, or is going more into relation to game? Because one of the things that I've been seeing, if we looked at the last Champions League, or we're starting to see what's going on. For example, we look at teams like Bayern Munich, or we look at teams like Liverpool. For me today, those are like the top clubs at the moment that have the best games out there. We're seeing a lot of quickness, speed. They're looking for people who are fast, a game that's really fast paced. And if we look at someone like Bayern Munich, it's one of the teams that I love the most to see play, is how intense they are in their defense. They're really, really always above. They don't let you breathe. If you have the ball, they're on top of you. And when they get the ball, they're suffocating you in your box trying to get a goal. So as we see, this is a very physical game. And the question again is, what are the new things coming out in strength and conditioning that is affecting soccer in a positive way?
Look, I think the game has obviously evolves quite rapidly, and every 5 years or so, you see a new style of play, a new sort of approach to the game, and then obviously right now, I think in terms of high intensity, it's probably been the highest it's ever been, and because of the nonstop pressing and teams playing more in the final third. So then that only has affected the training practices. So then I think that has raised the level of intensity of practices and how the coaches approach the training on a day-to-day basis. So I think with the growing influence of technology on the sport, I mean, we can talk about GPS units and optical tracking and what have you. I think that has raised the level of the game in terms of the information you can provide, and in terms of the influence you can have on the coaches of whether making suggestions in terms of training session modifications or what have you. I think that's the direction that the game will continue to grow, and I think the game will continue to evolve, and there's a massive sort of influence of technology as there has been over the last 5 to 10 years on the game. So then, in order to sort of better support the coaches and the staff in terms of training, in terms of raising the level of intensity of training, uh, this will only continue to grow larger and larger and have more and more influence on what actually takes place on the training pitch. And then there's a lot of literature that have come out over the recent years looking to marry sort of the tactical technical elements of training and games into the physical side. So then you're always have a underlying theme for both when you step on the pitch, and there's not necessarily a division of the two that, hey, conditioning coach, you do the runs at the end or you do the runs in the middle, and then I'll just take care of the rest. Now there's more and more are clubs and teams are looking to find ways where you can kill two birds with one stone, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you do mention a really good point. It all depends on where the game is evolving. It all depends on what's going on. And like I mentioned before, the more I see football or soccer, however you want to call it, it's becoming such a fast-paced game. I mean, as I'm seeing it, like teams again, Bayern Munich, as we look at the style of the game, we look at Liverpool, PSG with people like Mbappe or Neymar, where you got Di Maria, people who are really, really fast. Obviously, we're starting to see, and this is probably from the last decade that's coming in. Like, you're seeing the full backs are people that are just very quick, just as well as the people who are the wingers. They have to be really quick. They're, exploiting our wings is something that is super important. I mean, the famous touchy ball football that Spain was doing back in the early 2000s, and with that kind of has disappeared as well. I mean, it's nice. Spain has that to be able to have the possession of the game, but you're starting to see that not really happen anymore, not having the ball so much. You want to be able to get to the box quick, score, and you want to be able to have people who are really, really fast, are able to keep themselves in good position and just really quick at the game itself. I mean, and we look at the last Champions League final, you saw two teams who play like that, but you saw one of them who was physically, you can totally tell that was physically better. And, obviously, technically, I think it's the best team in the world right now. And the game that they have is a huge example of where the game is going. And slowly everything is moving towards that side. So it's going to be interesting to see what strength and conditioning is going to start doing to adapt to that style of game, to that evolution of the game, because the more it's going forward, more teams are doing it. And I'm starting to see things over here in the Latin American countries always trying to do that as well. Obviously, there's always going to be different styles of play. There's going to be people who are obviously going to focus a little more on the possession of the ball and all that. But again, the game is moving at a very fast pace today. And for the entertainment purpose, I think it's amazing. I think it's fun. I think it's better. I think it's going to be a quicker style of a game, and it's going to be better for the people to view. And for strength and conditioning is going to be really interesting, because we're going to start looking at, when we start looking at players, what are we looking for? We're going to look people who are fast, who are going to be, have a certain type of genotype or prototype to be able to be in a certain position. I think we already do that, but it's going to be more specific as it starts going on. And we're going to see in the later years what happens with the game.
Yeah, look, I think just the way it's evolving and sort of shifting in that direction of continued increase in intensity and increased competitive demands, I think at the end of the day, our sort of role will become even more and more important, because now, go back to a point you mentioned earlier, we will have even more of an importance and sort of contribution in terms of improving player resilience and robustness, so they can handle these loads and then play potentially up to 3 matches a week, which they have been doing since the pandemic. So then these are sort of the challenges that will come up, and then obviously couple that with the ongoing research on these topics, we'll look to sort of evolve with the time and with the sort of the evolution of the game, and kind of look to provide the services potentially in different ways, and then sort of taking on different challenges. But that's not to say that the wheel is going to be reinvented. I think the basics at the end, they will continue to remain the basics. It's just the application of them and how you go about addressing these challenges and different scenarios on any given sort of situation.
Before we go, I think you mentioned a really good point. The basics will always remain the same. And this is something that, as a rehab coach, I want to emphasize a lot. I don't care if you're the healthier guy or you're recovering from an injury, the basics always remain the same. As you say, you just modify as you move forward. You just look for a different type of goal. You look to improve a certain type of aspect physically in the performance world to be able to, get something positive out of it in the game. And I think that's one of the best points you made today. The basics remain the same. The game will keep evolving, but we build always upon a basis. And as we know, we don't all know the basics. The basics is a lot of things. It covers a lot of areas. It covers a lot of stuff, but we always need to try to never ignore them. Always keep our mind that we always build upon them. And if we're in doubt, just go back to them. And it's one of the best things to do, is not try to make things so complex and so complicated. Build upon the basics, focus from there, modify what you need to do. And yeah, the game is going to keep evolving. It's going to be fun. Like I said, it's going to be fun to see where it goes. As you mentioned, the demand is going to grow more. But, you know, people want to see more games. There's more competitions being now with the UEFA and Nations League. And I think CONMEBOL and I think CONCACAF and Africa and all these people want to make their own Nations League as well. And where this is going, and now this World Cup in Qatar is going to be in winter, and then we're going to start seeing also World Cups that are longer because they're going to have more teams included in the thing. So more games, more demand, more stuff. Now for strength and conditioning coaches as us, we're going to have to really think about it. How do we keep our athletes performing at a high level, but at the same time keep them healthy so the show can go on and that doesn't become an issue. And I think it's one of the biggest things that is going to continue to be a debate in this world of football. With that being said, man, thank you so much for joining us today. Have a little conversation about strength and conditioning, the academy, and talk a little bit about certain type of points in the world of football. As you know, this can be a really long debate. We can get really specific in a certain type of strength and conditioning aspect, and this can go on for hours. And maybe I'll have you on again here over, and we can talk about a very specific point in strength and conditioning. But it's nice to introduce you into here and talk a little bit about this. And thank you.
No, absolutely. It's been a pleasure, Roberto. Thank you.
Thank you, man. And we see each other again. I know this has been some shit year. So wherever we go from now, I know you're out of Atlanta United, and I hope you can find another place around the football world, and I hope you can see around this area and keep growing as a strength and conditioning coach. You have a lot to give out, a lot to teach. You have a great resume, and I've spoken to you plenty of times, and there's a lot that you can give out in the world of strength and conditioning in the world of football.
No, I appreciate it, man. Thank you very much.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining us in this podcast, in this new episode. Stay tuned for more, and this will be it.